geographical and methodological today. I'll just hand it over to you. And as in all previous times, very important sign paper. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Indrek. And hello, everybody. Welcome to my third lecture. It's nice to see some familiar faces. Nice that you're here again. For those of you who haven't been here, yesterday and the day before yesterday, I presented historical material. So 2 days ago, I presented a collection of magical manuscripts from the 18th century. Yesterday, I presented some findings from my research into contemporary magic, magic with a K. And today, I will step back a bit from the historical dimension of Western magic and ponder more generally whether magic can function as a term, as a plausible category in the study of religion, a second-order category. And if so, if we could even formulate a theory of magic, which is an experiment for me. It's something I've never done before, so it's the first time today, and I will go through a lot of material, a lot of thoughts. I will be fairly quick because we have to leave at 1:30 sharp, because I have to take the bus then. And so please feel free to ask me questions, but be quick and I will answer quick, because I really want to get through the stuff in order to arrive at my conclusions, which will completely disappoint you, but that's how it is. Anyway, whoops. That's a good start. What's going on? Okay. So, the lecture has 5 parts. First, I will try to explain what it means to work with magic or to think about magic in the sense of a second-order category in the 21st century after so many failed definitions and so much deconstruction that has been done regarding the very concept of magic. So there are many people who call into question whether this is possible, what I tried today. And I will try to outline how it could be done, or how I think it could be done. And it could be done by disentangling magic into smaller bits and pieces on 3 different domains: conceptual, intellectual, discursive, and ritual. And in each domain, we will look for material and try to compare it. So it's comparative religion today. And finally, I will arrive at some conclusions and what this means for a possible theory of magic. So first, some remarks on magic as a second-order category. The question I pose today is, how can magic be conceptualized as a meaningful category that is applicable to any religious data, independent of its timely, geographical, or cultural contexts? So this is really, one could be reminded of phenomenology of religion. So there is a thing in the world which we can find in different times and places and cultures, and we could call it magic. And what do we need for that? And what is a meaningful second-order category anyway? So are you familiar with the differentiation between first-order, second-order, and third-order categories? Anybody? So first-order categories would be the categories that the religious people use. That's, so to speak, the amic terminology, the terminology on the level of the sources. And we as scholars, we use different terms, which would be a second-order level. And then there's even a third-order debate on the terms. So you can go up the levels. And there are many people who have questioned magic as a second-order category because it's such a problematic term, so polemical and so vague. And I would say that there are 5 prerequisites that plausible second-order categories have to have They have to avoid basic conceptual traps. So no circular definitions, no definitions ex negativo. That means magic is not religion or not science. So that's not enough. It doesn't work. We need semantic precision. A term has to be not too broad or not too narrow. It can't mean tons of things which don't belong together, and it cannot be too specific, and things that fall out of the category that we want to have inside. Modern categories cannot be essentialist, so there is no essence. There cannot be an essence of magic that we trace through time. That's not how modern categories in religious studies work. They should be non-Eurocentric, if that's possible at all. So every term has its location and contextual meaning, but we can try to be less Eurocentric, or as least as possible. And the term should allow for meaningful comparison. It should not only highlight similarities. So, magic is always sympathetic rituals from antiquity to today. So we lump together all these rituals, and they're all the same, of course, because we defined magic like that in the first place. But that's kind of boring. We also want to see varieties and differences. So the thing is that I don't know any definition or theory that meets these criteria. Most existing definitions define magic ex negativo. So magic is something which is not science and not religion. And so you have the magic, science, religion triangle. You have circular definitions. And you fall into the trap that you cannot separate the terms. And then you say something, okay, this is a magical religious rite, or magico-religious rite. Or it's somewhere between magic and science. But that's not satisfactory, because then the terms are often too broad or too narrow. They essentialize magic by referring to an allegedly distinct, unique, and unalterable thing in the world, which is kind of the old phenomenological idea that we have ideal types which exist independent of time and space, and we can just observe them in the history of religion. That's what we don't want to do. And as I've shown yesterday and the day before yesterday, Western learned magic, in the sense how I conceptualize it from a discursive perspective, it changes all the time. So it's not one thing. It has a large variety of different ritual techniques and mechanics, ideas, discursive contexts, etc. So that's the real world. It's changing, it's ever-changing, and it's complex. And categories should reflect that. And most magic definitions of magic are derived from Western stereotypes. So mostly Christian, even Protestant ideas of religion, and then magic is the rest. And therefore, they are usually very Eurocentric, which we also don't want to have. And many definitions of magic, they just create wastebasket categories of things we cannot allocate to religion or science. And they therefore highlight similarities, which is also not what modern comparison should be about. So if we want to avoid that and still engage in comparison and do a plausible comparative study of religion today, we also have to think how comparison actually works. And in fact, you may be aware that comparison had a decline since the decline of the phenomenology of religion. It more or less has a bad reputation, at least in the religious studies field, which I'm aware of, particularly in Germany, in fact, because comparison is said to be essentialist. You decontextualize the things you compare, which is problematic. You ahistoricize them, and then you put them next to each other as if they're all apples and peas. And modern, or at least since the 80s, religious scholars have specialized highly on very unique topics because they feel that they're not able to compare many things from many different cultures and religions, as has been done previously. But the modern bashing of comparison neglects the fact that comparison is part of every analytical process. So we actually compare all the time. We can't avoid it. Every study in the history of religion is comparative. You compare different manuscripts, you compare texts as they wander over the centuries, you compare the different contexts, different authors. We compare all the time, but usually we do it in a contextual, so we stay within one framework, within one historical context, or genealogical way. We compare things over time. So comparison is always there. It's also in interviews, in discourse analysis. We compare all the time. But usually we don't use the label anymore. But today, we will try that. We will try to do large-scale, cross-cultural, diachronic, analogical comparison. But how do we do that if we don't want to relapse into these outdated essentialist definitions or speak about heuristic categories, which basically means nothing, or rely on the vagueness and arbitrariness of everyday language? So what we will do, what I will try to do today is conceptual reverse engineering. That is a term coined by Ann Taves. Have you ever heard of that? Anyone? Yeah, maybe. So the idea is to have a complex cultural construct, which is magic, so complex categories that have evolved over long times and have a huge semantic field. You cut it into smaller bits and pieces. And these smaller bits and pieces I will use as tertia comparationis. So I will not compare magic as a broad monster category. This is magic, that is magic. But I will look what is in the category of magic that we can compare meaningfully across times and spaces. And of course, any meaningful comparison has to begin with what we know. So I will take the Western history of magic, because magic is not a universal thing. It is a Western term that started in ancient Greece when Greek authors referred to the Persian priests, the magoi, and then it went on through Rome and all sorts of Europeanist religious contexts. And this is the term magic where we start with, and we look into this history, what magic meant here and there and what it was used for. And by doing that, we will see that there are three different domains that we have to distinguish. So we have to distinguish the conceptual-intellectual domain, the discursive domain, and the ritual domain. And I will explain to you what these three domains mean while actually doing it. So we will start with the conceptual-intellectual domain. Any questions so far? No, good. So the conceptual-intellectual domain compares concepts, so terms, conceptual history, and ideas. That's intellectual history. That's why I call it conceptual-intellectual domain. There are no terms without ideas, otherwise they would be empty. There are, of course, empty signifiers, but magic is not an empty signifier. It's a floating signifier, as I've shown yesterday and the day before yesterday. Yes, it's actually full of meanings, but these meanings changed in history over the course of its use, and it changed always depending on the context. And when you look into this conceptual history, the Western conceptual history of magic, there were at least 4 core ideas, what magic actually means. So these are the ideas attached to the concept. And I would say that these 4 ideas are ritual, power, miracle, and wish fulfillment. There is more. There are more ideas, but these are the big 4. One could argue that there is a big 5, because there's also divination, but that's a genuinely Western Christian development, that divination was kind of discarded from religion in late antiquity, and so magic was associated with divination, but I think this is not at the core of the term, and I will omit divination today. So first, ritual. In Western history, one of the basic meanings of magic was ritual, or ritual practice. There were also other terms. So in the Greek magical papyri, for instance, there is often pragmateia or praxis, which is in fact practice at the beginning of the rituals. In Latin text, the corresponding term is experimentum, which means more or less the same. And there is the formulation of the artes magicae, as you may know, the magical arts. So you could also say it's the ritual arts. And since its conceptual beginnings in classical Greece, magic was associated with the performance of certain rites. Not any rites, because there were, of course, also rites in all the religious contexts, frameworks, and traditions, but certain rites that tapped on kind of certain powers that aimed at rather miraculous events and that often focused on individual wish fulfillment. So these four meanings are combined, but most importantly in Western history, they also developed independently of one another. So there could be miracles with or without rituals, or there could be rituals with or without power. There could be power without rituals. There could be miracles without power. There could be wish fulfillment without rituals. So there are a lot of variations of these four things in Western history. And you will find this notion mirrored in formulations like to do magic, so to practice something, or in the idea of the magic book, which you even find in modern Playmobil witches. So she has a book. There are some practices described in that book. As we've seen yesterday, many such books exist. So let's now look into other cultural religious contexts and look for concepts which resemble the semantics of magic in the sense of ritual practice. And I will start with a, so to speak, Western example, of an example from Western learned magic. That's just one ritual description from the Greek magical papyri. It's a short manual of how to produce a phylacterion, so a protective, an apotropaic amulet. And I will not go into the details here, but this is basically what mageia means in the Greek magical papyri, or praxis. It's you do something. This is the Ouroboros, the snail that bites its tail. You have characteres, so all sorts of different ritual techniques. And this is directed against demons, against every sickness and suffering. It is to be inscribed onto gold, silver, or tin, and then worn. And it works. So this is just one of millions of examples of some recipes in Western learned magic. Now, if we look at other contexts which are not related to Western learned magic, or at least not directly, not in a historical sense, one example is an old Akkadian text called, so some people didn't know that it starts at 12. No problem. So I will go rather quickly over all these examples. They're just examples, and I try to show something on a more abstract level. So there is this text called Maklu, which dates to around 800 before Christ. It's usually written on 9 stone tablets in cuneiform script. That's how it looks like. That's Old Akkadian. I can't read it, so I'm not competent in some of the stuff I present today, but I'm looking for terms which are meta-categories for rituals in other languages, and which could plausibly be equalized or translated with magic. And this ritual provides the lengthiest and most elaborate apotropaic ritual script directed against malevolent rituals of unknown witches, kashaptu in Old Akkadian, which are seemingly responsible for the disease of a client. And this text is very important in ancient Mesopotamian religion. It was even part of the teaching curriculum of the Assyrian scribes. So it was really part of the religious mainstream, as it were. And there are many copies surviving which attest this. Now, the overall concept used to denote this ritual practice in this text is ashiputu, translated by Schwemer, who is like the German specialist on this matter, as exorcistic law or art of conjuration. And ashiputu is in fact a genuine text genre in ancient Mesopotamia with thousands of different canonical texts. So it's really a huge thing. It's a category for rituals that are in a way part of medicine, but they complement medicine in the sense that they use conjurations, godly forces, etc. for healing purposes. And this ritual begins in the evening and lasts until the next morning. The basic ritual technique is the uttering of conjuration formula addressed to Babylonian gods. But the heart of the ritual consists of burning all sorts of statuettes, which are put into the fire. And these represent the ritual aggressors. So maklu literally means burning. And that's just a passage from the text. Whoever you are, who took clay for my figurine from the river, who buried figurines for me in the dark house. So that's what the witches allegedly have done to hurt me. So I'm doing a counter ritual. I trust in the steady light of the fire god, the judge, fire god, burn her, the statues, etc. So it's also an apotropaic ritual, like the one we saw in the first example, the phylacterion, with some kind of different ritual elements, but there are many similarities, I would say, and there is an overall concept used, ashiputu, which we might compare to the term mageia, to the Greek understanding of magic or the late ancient Greek. Then I will make a huge jump to India and have a look at the Atharva Veda. You probably all know that the Atharva Veda is part of the Vedas. It's the holy Sanskrit text of the Brahmins, and it is today considered the fourth and last component of the Vedic corpus, dated to circa 900 before Christ, for the Common Era. And the Atharva Veda is different from the other three Vedas in that it is foremost a ritual compendium. I don't know if you've ever looked at it. There are just ritual descriptions, one after the other, mostly about healing, protection, love, prosperity, and other inner worldly matters. And it is sometimes called the Veda of magical formulas, because there are all these rituals directed at more or less inner worldly goals. And our example is taken from book 3, entitled Imprecations Against Demons, Sorcerers, and Enemies. So it's the same idea, an apotropaic rite directed against other things, forces, people who caused problems for me. And now the Sanskrit meta-category is abhichara. And abhichara is often translated as black magic, but it is in fact a subcategory of kriya or karman, which in the Vedas denote the ritual sacrificial actions of the Brahmins in general. Usually the sacrifices is done for the benefit of gods. So it's for something, and abhichara is defined in the sense that it's directed against something or someone. So that's kind of the conceptual difference. But abhichara is part of, so to speak, the Vedic understanding of ritual. It's not like a completely separated thing. And I will not go through this just that you've seen. So this is also a talisman. You produce a talisman made from a certain wood. And then this is probably something the Brahman utters in order to kind of load the talisman with the power of Indra, in this case, the god. And so all the sorceries may fail, blah, blah, blah. It's kind of similar rhetorics in a very different religious framework. So let's try to compare and conclude. And I want to stress that there is no comparative survey of concepts from other cultures that couldn't be translated as magic yet. So no one has done this. It exists for religion, for ritual, but not for magic. And I think that this very small selection, and I will go through other material, so I can only choose a few examples each, shows that these terms, so abhichara, mageia, and ashiputu, can be meaningfully compared. So there are similarities, but there are also differences. The similarities are that these concepts refer to a specific type of rituals that focus on inner worldly goals, in this case protection. They all have a recipe-like style. There are always transcendent addressees and agents of ritual efficacy, so it's the gods that make the ritual happen. And there is the use of word, speech, herbs, artifacts, certain ritual techniques, which we look into in greater detail at in the third part of the lecture. But there are also differences on the level of ritual, the ingredients used, the addressees, how the efficacy of the ritual is explained, and the social context is very different. So mageia was clearly, even in late ancient Egypt, probably marginal, deviant, suppressed. It's kind of unclear. but it was under Roman law certainly forbidden. So this was maybe an underground art, but in the case of the Maklu ritual and the Atharva Veda, it is clearly part of mainstream religion. So we have the same thing in very different discursive constellations, and I will stress that a bit more in the second part of the lecture. So ritual is just one component, a semantic component of magic. Another one is power. That was a basic meaning of magic. Also force, there are other terms, pneuma, sympatheia. So Jesus, for instance, in the Bible worked with pneuma, but other people thought it's just magia. And there are many modern examples of this. So you have a power magic battery pack here. So magic just means power, okay? Or this stones have power. I just visited 3 stone shops with Indrek in Tartu. So this is another core meaning of magic. And interestingly, power was isolated from ritual. It was taken away from ritual in the history of magic, in the conceptual history of magic, by Plotinus. And he said that sympatheia is the force that ties all existing things together. And the magician just uses or addresses or controls sympatheia. And then came Marsilio Ficino in the early modern period in the 15th century, and he said sympatheia is magia. So magic means power, and so magia naturalis is the discipline with which we can control this power. The power is everywhere. It makes the trees grow. It makes the sun move. It's all magic. It's just power. And now let's look at concepts in other cultural religious contexts which resemble these semantics of magic in the sense of power. And one term that comes, at least to my mind, very quickly, is Heka, the old Egyptian or Middle Egyptian concept of Heka. Anyone ever heard of Heka? Yeah. Maybe not, yeah. So Heka had different meanings in the old Egyptian religion. First of all, it was a powerful god, so an important god. It's not so known as Re or Atum, but it's there. It was responsible for creation, protection, and destruction. It was a very high god in the Egyptian hierarchy. But it was also considered to be a substance that can be eaten. So you can eat Heka, you can possess it in your body, and you can lose it. And thirdly, you can practice Heka. So iri Heka means to make Heka, particularly by means of speech. So Heka, one could say, personifies the divine creative destructive power per se, which holds the universe together. It's a similar idea. And the old Egyptian priests could identify with Heka in their ritual. It is not me, but Heka who says this, blah, blah, blah. And so they identify with Heka, and then they could ritually operate with this divine power. And also, Heka was important during the post-mortal journey because you could defend malevolent spirits that try to hinder you on your journey. So Heka was kind of very crucial to the old Egyptian religion. And Erich Hornung, a German Egyptologist, even claimed that Heka is the atomic energy of early humankind, which is kind of absurd. But Heka has even indeed be translated as god of magic or force or simply magic. So again, we have a term that is not so much related to ritual, but more to the general meaning of power in a different religious context. And another concept that would be worth comparing, I will not go into great detail with this, but it's the Melanesian concept of mana, how it was originally found by Codrington in the late 19th century. I'm not speaking about the mana theories of the 20th century, but it was in fact an original Melanesian concept used by the people. And they generally used mana to denote a supernatural power. And this power could be everywhere or anywhere. It could be ascribed to stones, people. I could have mana, spirits could have mana, practices could have mana, or they could not have mana, power. Certain prayers could be more mana-full than others, and many other things. So mana could be achieved, stored, lost, directed, controlled. And this is just another example for a religious term which denotes general meaning of power. So let's compare. Heka, if we look at Heka, the notion of God and substance differ from the Neoplatonian understanding of mageia, but the notion of power is similar. So there are similarities and differences. And it is possible to practice it, to practice Heka or to practice mageia. And in the case of mana, it does not refer to a specific God, unlike Heka, but like Heka, it can be understood as a substance, unlike mageia. So both Heka and Mena exist independent of the notion of ritual. So there can be, so Heka, Mana, and Sympatheia can be power without ritual. I think it's just interesting to compare and see these similarities and differences. So a third important meaning of magic was miracle. Miracle in the sense of extraordinary, wondrous event or ability. So today this notion can still be found in sports journalism. There are simply outstanding sportsmen and their abilities, they are extraordinary and miraculous, magic Jordan. And in fact, from classical Greece onwards, magicians were ascribed or claimed to be capable of flying, invisibility, bilocation, controlling natural events, the flow of rivers, drawing down the moon, for instance, is a common trope, or other people's feelings, actions, and destinies. So things we usually think that are not possible, and also in antiquity, usually we would assume that this is not possible for everyone. It's not an everyday observation, at least. And a crucial line of argument in Western polemics, anti-magical polemics, was whether these miraculous events and abilities were evoked with or without rituals. So this is, again, important to note. The Christian apologetics of Jesus claimed that he did his miracles without rituals, and the pagan defenders of Apollonius von Tyana said exactly the same, and that Jesus was the magician because he used rituals, and Apollonius did not need rituals. So miracle was also detached from ritual, or it was related to ritual. Now let's look for concepts which resemble the semantics of magic in the sense of miracle. And one concept which quickly comes to my mind is the Sanskrit term siddhi, literally meaning perfections. It goes through the Asian history of religions. You can find it in many Buddhist and Hindu texts as an important category. One of the earliest and most important sources is the Yoga Sutra attributed to Patanjali, so we are roughly in the 4th century Common Era. And in chapter 3 of this book, Patanjali goes through more than 30 of these siddhi, and he explains how they can be achieved. Namely, you only have to concentrate on certain aspects of reality. And these siddhi include invisibility, pre-knowledge, communication with all beings, immense power, glowing body, levitation, moving without one's body. Very fascinating list. And all you have to do is to be so advanced in your meditation that you can combine the 3 highest states of mind and arrive at a one-pointed concentration called samyama. And then you use this concentration to focus on certain aspects of reality which are related to the siddhi. Patanjali also mentioned that some people can do it by birth, or some people can do it with drugs, and there are certain practices which he doesn't go into detail with. Yes, and interesting with siddhi is that there are no anti-siddhi polemics which are comparable to anti-magical polemics in Asian religious texts. There are warnings to not boast with these abilities, and they are actually not important for the path and for the final goal, which is enlightenment. So you should never stick to them, but there are no massive polemics like you find them against magicians. Just a few examples. When samyama is done on the form of one's own physical body, the illumination or visual characteristic of the body is suspended, and it is thus invisible to other people. So that's how you become invisible. By samyama on the strength of elephants comes a similar strength, so you can become very strong. by directing the flash of inner light of higher sensory activity, knowledge of subtle objects, those hidden from view, so kind of distant viewing. And this is flying, levitation of the body by concentrating on certain aspects of the body. Another term that we have to think about when pondering the notion of miracle is the signum. The Christian concept of signum, the Latin term, means sign, but it means also miracle. And there is the practice of the Catholic practice of canonization. So we have all these saints, these holy people, which have a fama signorum. So they have a fame of signs that they that they have shown miracles. The usual suspect in modern canonization, let's say 20th century and 21st, is healing, because it's so hard to, falsify. Pre-modern saints were more advanced, so they could fly, bilocate, produce food, etc. So we have a similar list of abilities there. And this is Joseph of Cupertino, the flying frater from 17th century. Over 100 times he has been observed flying by contemporaries. He's quite famous in that regard. Important is that the miracles of Christian saints, they are not done by themselves, but they are always not done by God. They are just signs. They can't be controlled or evoked on purpose. Maybe you can do a plea and then it happens, but it's basically grace that makes them happen. So they are a sign of the saint's closeness to and chosenness by God. So we know this is a common topic in the history of religion, because the Christian figure of the saint has parallels in the Jewish figure of the Ishai Elohim, the man of God, the Islamic figure of Wali Allah, the friend of God, or the Indian or Tibetan figure of the Mahasiddha. So we have kind of people having these abilities everywhere. They are an omnipresent motive in the history of religion. But in the case of magic and siddhi, there is a stronger idea of controllability. So you actually do something, you practice something, and you can kind of control the thing. In contrast to kind of the monotheistic version, where it's always God who does it and you can't control it. And also, again, there is the discursive difference. Siddhi are more or less accepted. They are part of the religious discourse. There is no anti-siddhi discourse. In contrast to magic, so in Western history, we have this strong ambivalence. There are the saints, they can do miracles, but the magicians, if they do miracles, it's bad. The miracles are satanic, they're done by demons, they have done a demon pact, etc., and so we have to destroy them. So we have this ambivalence in the Western dealing with the idea of miraculous ability. Now, that's my fourth meaning. Another basic meaning was wish fulfillment. So we tend to, when we see a rite directed at love, charm, luck, wealth, healing, harm, protection, that's the usual suspect. We think it's magic, okay? Short-term inner-worldly goals, egocentric stuff. That's magic. But if we look for it in a comparative way, there are countless examples in the history of religion for this basic human tendency. Every religious tradition provides ritual means to pursue such goals. Otherwise, they would be of no real use, would they? And this motive is so omnipresent that I will just show a few examples. So we have the petitionary prayer in Christianity. We don't know how many of these wishes are uttered in churches every day. We have similar types of prayers in Islam, the dua. This is a saint shrine with all these wish notes placed on the altar. Of course, there are all sorts of rituals. In an Indian context, there's the category of the yajna. It's a kind of a wish fulfillment puja. There are shrines exclusively dedicated to wish fulfillment. The most famous one being the Erawan shrine in Bangkok. It's the shrine of wish fulfillment, so you can just go there and put an offering. Of course, you can also offer stuff to Buddha and maybe pronounce your wish mentally, even if it's not directed at enlightenment. And there are also all sorts of ancient examples, the most important being the animal sacrifice. And there are modern New Age versions, the wish to the universe, which I heard is also popular in Estonia. And I even just photographed this tree of wishes or wish notes in one of the bookshops Indrek and I visited. So the wish fulfillment cannot be an exclusive preserve of magic too. So what do we learn from this? I think it makes sense to distinguish different semantic facets of the Western concept of magic and to use these sub-elements, these sub-notions, semantic sub-notions, as the thing that we compare, instead of comparing magic as the broad meta-category. So these sub-notions serve as tertia comparationis. And this narrows the scope of the analysis, and we get better results. Because it makes sense to use these tertia comparationis in relation to other religious concepts, terms, and meanings from different cultural religious domains, and to look for similarities and differences. And by doing this, through comparison and juxtaposition, each element, may be understood a bit better. That's called reciprocal illumination in the modern methodology of comparison. And it's also interesting to note that none of the notions discussed so far is the exclusive preserve or essence of magic. So we again see that it is good to step back from such an essentialist understanding of magic and rather disentangle the things and then see that they are also in other religious contexts and frameworks. And a list of concepts that could be meaningfully compared as magic from a cross-cultural and diachronic perspective has yet to be written. So this is just a first list. No one has actually done this yet, which I find kind of weird. So far we have looked at concepts and ideas. Now we look at discourses. Where is the difference? The discursive domain is not so much about the semantic contents of language, but rather how language is used. What are the functions of language? What are the contexts? What do we do with it? And not what does it mean? And in the case of the Western concept of magic, I've distinguished two different discourses that have shaped its history from antiquity to today, namely what I call the discourse of exclusion and the discourse of inclusion. So there's a huge anti-magical discourse where magic is used to refer to others. They are bad. What they do is bad, bad, bad. I would never do that. And we don't know whether the person who is called magician or said to practice magic, whether he would actually do it himself. He would say, no, I'm not doing magic, stop. Or he would say, maybe that's the more seldom case, yes, you're right, I'm a magician. But that's the more seldom case. So usually it's a false attribution, and it's polemical, and it's used for other purposes. Yes, and then there's the discourse of exclusion, but I will now focus inclusion, so people referring to themselves with the term magic. But I will now focus on the discourse of exclusion, so on magic's discursive function to devalue and ostracize others, be it individuals, groups, or even entire religions. And so we will try to see if, from a comparative perspective, this is a particularly Western dynamic, so using magic as a polemical term to devalue others, or whether we can observe such dynamics also in other frameworks. But first, let's have a greater a look at how the Western polemics worked. So I would say that they were the dominant discourse. The polemical discourse was dominant until the mid or even late 20th century. I told you yesterday that it may have changed with Harry Potter. But I mean, there are still so many churchly polemics against Harry Potter and other types of fantasy literature, etc. So the discourse is going on, and there is still polemics, but the positive use is kind of dominant now, but it has not been that over the majority of Western history. And the three major stereotypes were that magic is anti-religious, it's not religion. It's inefficacious, it doesn't work. And it's antisocial, it destroys our societies. These are the big three stereotypes. And the first accusation, of course, relates to the opposition between magic and religion. So by saying you're a magician, I can say I'm a proper religious person, and then I can demarcate my boundaries of my religion more properly. That's one of the discursive functions. And the second relates to the opposition between magic and science, saying what I do is efficacious, but this is just magic. And the third to the allegedly devastating societal impact of magic. So that was just a polemical trope. Magic destroys individuals, psyches, and societies. And at least since the early Roman Empire, magic was considered a crime. So the crimen magiae was formulated around 50 Common Era, and this shaped medieval and early modern polemics and legislation, and ultimately led to the early modern European witch hunts, to which I will come briefly. What is important to note is that stereotypes, so these are stereotypes, they are seldom based on a proper interview of the person about which I have the stereotype. That is the same in the case of magic. So anti-magical polemics have rarely been based on proper reading of magical texts or interviews with the people, apart from law courts where the people were sitting on an iron chair and have been tortured. That's not what I consider an open-ended interview. And therefore, they may be completely inaccurate. They may tend to exaggerate, misunderstand, under or overemphasize, or grossly misrepresent what they're supposed to characterize. So stereotypes can function as a simplification of reality, but they also tend to completely misrepresent reality. And they usually suppress difference and highlight similarities. So magicians are always like that, blah, blah, blah. That may not really be there. Now, one discursive element, which is maybe not so much polemical, but also related to these polemics, is that we find in anthropological and folklore studies often traces that some folks have called other folks sorcerers, in the sense of people who do strange rituals which may be powerful or not. Okay, so there is this trope that the other group is the sorcerer group, and I'm not the sorcerer group. This is also an aspect of the Western history of magic. So, for instance, Plinius the Elder described the Druids around in the 1st century Common Era as magicians. That's just from the perspective of the Romans. So the Romans do proper religion, and the Druids do magic. So the entire Druid religion is a magical religion, in a polemical sense. And if you look into anthropological literature and folklore studies, you find that this is a very common phenomenon all across the globe or the history of religion, maybe not so much in the 21st century, but you find a lot in the 18th, 19th, 20th century. So, for example, in previous eras, from the perspective of the Finnish people, the Sami people were sorcerers. But from the perspective of Swedish people, the Finnish were the sorcerers. And you can find many such instances, the Sudanese from the perspective of Arabs in northern Africa, the Falasha from the perspective of the Ethiopians. And in Western history, you have, of course, the Jews. The Jews always had the stereotype to be magicians from the perspective of Christians and Muslims. In early modern times, there were also certain religious groups, like the Quakers, who were considered to be specialists in magic from the perspective of other groups. And today, we might have the case of the Sinti and Roma, which are still attached to the stereotype that they do all sorts of magic. So this is a thing that we can maybe plausibly find also in other contexts, to see the other group as being the sorcerer group. Now let's look at persecutions, like fully fledged, massive legislative impact of the polemical discourse in a bit greater detail. So let's first look at the early modern witch persecution and then think if this happened also elsewhere. So as you may or may not know, and I heard that there are a few witchcraft, witch hunt scholars here in Tartu. So they happened roughly between 1430 and 1700, with a climax between 1580 and 1650, so maybe roughly 350 years. We have an estimation of 50 to 60,000 executions over the course of this entire period in Europe. And depending on the region, circa 75% were women. In Central women, much more. In Central Europe, much more women than in Northern Europe. So there were countries in Northern Europe where the majority was even male, but overall, it was women were more often accused of being witches. The witch persecutions were based on an idea of witchcraft that encompassed 4 to 6 components. So this is important. The first one was the pact with the devil. So the witch always engaged in a pact with the devil. She or he coupled with the devil. That's the coupling. Then they all met, the witch Sabbath. And then there was the maleficium, the malevolent ritual act. So these 4 are the components of the witchcraft stereotype, the early modern. And then there was eventually the witch flight and animal transformation and some other marginal things. And important is that actually only the maleficium is something that you can observe from an, secular perspective. So you can see someone is doing something weird in the wood, throwing a stone behind his back, and then you can say, ah! But you can't really observe the devil, the pact with the devil. You can only ask someone under torture if that happened, and then eventually the person will say yes, and it looked like this, and then I talked to him, blah, blah, blah. So this is an imagination or a stereotypical idea of witchcraft, which is kind of manifested through action, through social persecution. So the imagination becomes real. And there are many causes, many explanations for why this happened. Theological innovations, so the idea of that the devil tries to take over Christianity, that's an early modern idea. We have changes in legislation. We have wars, diseases, economic crisis. We have the Reformation, had a huge impact on the witch hunts. We have letterpress printing. Some people say witch hunts wouldn't have happened without letterpress printing. We have, of course, gender stereotypes, which became more extreme at that time, maybe even weather phenomena, and one of the underlying conditions for the witch hunts were torture, certainly. There were basically 2 logics of accusation. So there was the bottom-up approach, denunciation, and there was the top-down approach. The top-down approach is once a person is denunciated and tortured, then there are these interrogatorien, so there are these fixed lists of questions, and there's always the question, who did you meet on the witch Sabbath? And then the names come up, and so the trial, the chain trials emerge. So suddenly there are 10 more people, and then you torture these. And the biggest list of kind of these Besagungsprozesse, and that's what the German term is, the people only accused because someone accused the person, the biggest list has around 1,300 names. So that's basically, at some point, half of the village is there. And we might say that these are dynamics that have kind of led to this immense persecution wave, or when there were waves. It's more complex than that, but that's the basic logic. Now, if we look at other types of witch hunts, and I will now look at contemporary witch hunts. So what's going on right now, or let's say in the last 30 years, we will find that over the past decades, witch hunts, I will soon explain what I mean by that, happened across the globe, and they cost far more victims compared to 300 years of European persecutions. So even if you only look at Tanzania, which is like the witch hunt melting pot in Africa, you have at least more than 1,000 victims per year. So you have, over the last 30 years, you basically have the same amount of executions, only in Tanzania. And if you accumulate all the other African regions where this happens, and also other regions in Asia, in South America, in the Near East, where witch hunts happen, you have hundreds of thousand victims over the past decades. Now, there is a very good UN report by Schnöbelen. If you're interested in that, I can send it to you if you send me an email. She uses a definition of witchcraft which reads, harmful actions carried out by persons presumed to have access to supernatural powers. So that's very basic. Just the idea that there are supernatural powers and that some people can tap on them by means of rituals. And in fact, if you use this very basic definition of witchcraft, you can find all these cases all over the world. But let's ask, is it really the same phenomenon compared to the European witch hunts? Now, there are similarities, I would say. The underlying similarity is that witchcraft explains misfortune. This is the big thesis of Edward Evans Pritchard. So witchcraft always comes into play when something bad happens. It can't happen by chance. Someone has attacked me. And another precondition is that there must be a belief in the efficacy of malevolent rituals in the population. Otherwise, it doesn't work. There have to be, so the similarities between the early modern witch hunts and the modern ones are that there are social, economic, political, medical crises. Diseases, AIDS, for instance, now in Africa. Usually the victims are weak and deviant, so there's a tendency to prosecute women, the poor, sick, or the children. Today there's a big thing of the child witch in some African countries, even by the parents. That's really tough thing. Anyway, the similarity is also that there are bottom-up prosecutions, sometimes even lynch law, so we have that too, and also economic benefits. So sometimes in early modern Europe and today in Africa, you can seize the properties of the people that you effectively denounce. And another parallel is that there are almost no self-proclaimed witches. So we don't know whether all these people who are persecuted or executed, whether they would consider themselves to be guilty of the charge, because that's not how the thing works. But then there are differences. The European cumulative concept of witchcraft, which I outlined before with these 4 to 6 elements, is not relevant for most modern persecutions, even in areas where Pentecostalism is strong. As you may know, Pentecostal Christianity is kind of big in many African countries. But usually they have an impact on exorcism, but they try to fight the witch persecutions today. So they don't have an impact on that. There is no comparable concept of the devil or a world conspiracy that we have to fight in modern Africa. And the modern persecutions are usually below the radar of legislation because the people have a distrust in the legislative colonial regimes, which actually have usually penalties against persecutions. So persecutions are forbidden. So it's under the radar of that. And we can also say that there are no chain trials based on torture or lists of alleged Sabbath participants. That's an early modern phenomenon. But it cannot be the explanation because today this is not needed. And then in Africa, the big thing is child witches, and there's this weird albino hunting, which is also awful. And there are all these migration movements because of all the poverty and the wars. And when a large group suddenly sits in a new region, then the thing happens which I showed previously. The other group can do powerful sorcery. We have a problem here. We have to fight them, blah, blah, blah. And finally, what is also interesting in modern Africa is that we have, in fact, ritual traditions which are very sophisticated and allow for all these rituals that the people think that happen to them. The Vodun traditions, for example, in Benin, Togo, Ghana, and Nigeria. And I would say that in early modern Europe, it's entirely unclear whether there were ever sophisticated ritual traditions performed by all these alleged witches. So to conclude, we don't need Christian demonology and the idea of Satan. We don't need public court cases, as was the case in early modern Europe, and torture-based chain trials to have massive prosecutions with thousands of victims per year. All it needs is poverty, maleducation, diseases, economical crisis, and a general belief in the efficacy of rituals to have people devalue, persecute, and kill one another. Thus, I think that there seems to be a basic human tendency to believe in the possibility of witchcraft in the sense of the definition I've shown previously. And this belief is, in fact, still very widespread globally today. So no secularization on a global scale, as you may know. In combination with the above-mentioned conditions, poverty, war, and disease, people tend to use the idea of the witch as a scapegoat for their miseries. And this really seems to be a universal phenomenon. Differences notwithstanding. So I have spoken almost an hour. I knew that I had too much stuff. So I will try to do this quick. The third domain is not the domain of concepts and ideas, and not of discursive functions, but of rituals. Let's look a bit more focused on different ritual techniques. And the basic question is whether there are similar sophisticated textual ritual traditions as Western magic, as the stuff I've shown yesterday and the day before yesterday, in other cultural religious contexts. So can we find similar ritual techniques, patterns, mechanics, and goals in non-Western ritual traditions, which are also text-based? So I'm not going into the whole oral folk stuff. A good example is a Tibetan book of spells from Dunhuang, which today sits in the British Library. Many such spell books exist in Tibetan Buddhism, but they have rarely been studied so far. So there's a lot of material, and we don't know much about it, because magic and Buddhism seems to be a contradiction, right? Buddhists strive for enlightenment, not for adding to karmic bad stuff. But this spell book, and it is one of many, contains hundreds of recipes for all kinds of purposes, among them treasure seeking. So there is treasure seeking in Tibet, as well as in early modern Europe, as I've shown yesterday, or the day before yesterday. Healing, drying up a lake, reversing a river, finding a woman, breaking up two lovers. So the usual stuff, actually. And interestingly, the rites here function mainly by mantras and mudras. That's how this spell book looks like. And this is just a few examples. To cure an illness, first it is important to do the appropriate mudras to cure the illness. Make the sermonic gesture with the index finger. So it's just a different type of ritual. But to dry up a lake, you can also use mudras and mantras. So it's all based on a certain mantra addressed to a certain deity, Tibetan deity. And you can dry up the lake when you beat an effigy, a spirit, a snail spirit made from gold, by saying the mantra, and then throw it into the lake. And I love this one. If a malevolent person appears and you want them to be struck by lightning or a meteor, make this mudra. Draw into your palm the middle finger, ring finger, and little finger of your left hand, and raise your forefinger. Cross your thumb and forefinger across the middle joint. I don't know if that's correct. Recite the mantra, then use the mudra to indicate where it will strike. Destruction will come quickly. Amazing. That's one example. Another one is a Taoist text called Tai Shangling Bao Wufu Xu from China. That's 4th century. Literally explanations of the 5 luminous treasure talismans. This ritual is based on the Taoist idea of 3 corpses or 3 worms. Have you ever heard of that? So they believe in creatures, demonic creatures that live inside the human body, in the head, chest, and abdomen, and they are what makes us grow old and become sick. So there are many Taoist rites addressed at longevity and ultimately immortality by distracting these demons from the body. And this particular rite works with 5 talismans. So you can find one example. They are ascribed to the 5 cardinal directions. The 5th one is the center. And it's again a very complex rite. It takes place at midnight. You make a 3-day retreat before fumigations, animal sacrifice, you sacrifice a white goose, you make fruit and wine offerings, you have 5 mats, which you place in the cardinal directions and 1 in the middle. And then you place the talismans on the mats, and then you conjure 5 spirits, they're called tearchs, emperors. And strikingly, the guy or the person utters that I perform a purification rite in order to certify my contract with the spirits. So there was a lot of talk in early modern Europe about contracts. So the witches and the magicians, they made literally a contract with the devil. And here we have it in a Taoist rite. And this is what this will do. The talisman will allow me to go anywhere without hindrance. I will find all the herbs. I will go wherever I desire. So it's kind of a very fast movement. They will enable me to command ghosts and spirits. I will live long and have lasting visions, blah, blah, blah. Kind of miraculous stuff. Most importantly, it will preserve my body, causing the 3 corpses to fade away. So, another interesting rite that resembles many elements and patterns that we know, that at least I'm familiar with from Western magic. My third and final example is a tantric text called Mantra Mahodadi, Great Ocean of Mantras. Its early modern text was written in 1588, and it is popular in India until today, according to Gudrun Bühnemann, who made an edition of this text. This text outlines the mantras of different deities and the corresponding rituals. And chapter 25 is dedicated to the so-called 6 rites of magic. And 5 of them fall under the category of abhichara, which I've shown previously. It's subjugation, immobilization, enmity, eradication, liquidation. Subjugation is controlling someone. Immobilization is that someone cannot move. Enmity is make 2 people unlike one another, so discarding people, tearing people apart. Eradication is making someone leave a location, and liquidation is causing death. And appeasement is more friendship. And the text is really outlining a complex rite based on 19 elements. And depending on which of the 6 goals you choose, you do a different, on these 19 domains, you do different things. You conjure a different deity, visualize the deity in a different way. You choose a different season, cardinal direction, a different day, posture. You choose different mantras, mandalas, mudras, and yantras. So you use all this stuff in the ritual, different breathing techniques, and then it's all about a fire ritual. So the fire is done with different woods, and the rosary, blah, blah, blah. So a lot of sophisticated explanations for this ritual, and I will not show the ritual here. I only find it interesting that there should be Brahmins with you, Brahmins, and you feed the Brahmins because the sin that accrues from destructive magical rites vanishes by the auspicious utterance of the Brahmins. So you do the bad magic, and the Brahmins sit there and pray for your benefits so that you don't accumulate negative karma. I find that quite fascinating, because obviously this, from a discursive perspective, this is part of, it's part of the Brahmin world, so it's not separated from religion. So conclusions, we found some highly sophisticated, formalized, and text-based ritual traditions in different non-Western religious contexts, which resemble many elements that we find in Western magic. Of course, there are also differences, but it is striking to see that similar ritual techniques have emerged in different times and places, historically independent from one another. Of course, ritualization always makes use of the basic human conditions. It's always about speech, how to use the body. We have substances, fumigation, so fire is usually quite important. We have time frames, cardinal directions. So, I mean, these are the circumstances with which you work in a ritual. Artifacts, animals, and spirits. But I think all these rites seem so similar that they belong to the same category, don't they? That's the question. And that's where my conclusions disappear. That's where my conclusions disappeared. Something just happened. It switched to this screen. I didn't do nothing.
I see on my recording device I see the right picture.
Huh? We might use the time for some questions. Any questions or comments so far before I present my conclusions, which are not really conclusions and there's no theory behind that? Okay, I will do that first. So, I think reverse engineering the Western concept of magic, we differentiated 3 domains. The conceptual-intellectual, so we had ritual, power, miracle, wish fulfillment as semantic components. The discursive and the ritual domain. The discursive domain was all about othering, stereotypes, prosecution. And the ritual domain was about all sorts of ritual techniques. And we used all these sub-elements as tertia comparationis from a transcultural perspective. Okay, now we have to wait. Warten. Wait. Dum-de-dum. Was there a question? Yes.
Yes.
Seite reagiert nicht. Okay, question.
Yes. To what extent, if any, are you concerned with distinguishing between religion and magic? I ask this question for 2 reasons. First of all, many of the case studies you gave, it's ambiguous whether they be religion or magic or both. And then second, the core ideas, tertia comparationis approach which you take, which, by the way, I support very much, overlaps a lot with a similar approach to religion.
So, maybe I will finish my talk and then answer your question. Okay? So, by doing that, what I've done, we found a lot of similar patterns. And we might call them phenomena in all 3 domains while looking at non-Western examples and materials. So there are differences on the object level, but it seems that magic nonetheless points to a vast range of similar phenomena across different times and cultures. But how do we explain these similarities? And that's where a theory would come into play. So until now, we have only compared. We have kind of worked with a concept in a certain way, and then we found a lot of material and tried to compare the material. But how do we explain the similarities? In order to explain the similarities, we would need a theory. And unfortunately, there is no theory currently that would explain these similarities on these 3 different domains. Because most existing theories of magic are based on outdated mono or polythetic definitions, which are often derived from anthropological material. So we would have to develop a new theory. And I cannot present this theory. That's why I said that I would disappoint you. But I can at least point to the questions the theory should pose. I think the questions would be, why do humans tend to believe in the efficacy of rituals, in miracles or occult powers? That would be the first domain. And for the answers, we would have to look more into cognitive studies. So there are cognitive theories of magic which partially now explain why we tend to believe in the efficacy of rituals. I will not go into this today. But for this aspect of magic, we would have find some answers maybe in cognitive studies. Also why humans tend to ascribe efficacy to transcendent realms and believe in miraculous events, etc. So there are some answers to that. But why do humans tend to other others and the ritual? So that would be the second domain. We would rather have to look in social psychology and look for explanations why humans tend to other each other anyway, also in other contexts. So magic is just one example of othering. Also, religious othering is, as you know, huge, and magic is just one aspect of that. But the explanation here would not come from cognitive studies, but rather from social psychology. And how is it that humans develop specific ritual techniques independently? That would be the third domain. Why do these rituals look so similar in these many different contexts? I would not know right now where the answers would be, but I would assume that ritual theory or ritual studies could maybe provide some more sophisticated answers to that. Yes. So this is what a theory, this is what the theory should maybe pose at the beginning, the question, and then we would have to look for different types of explanations of different types of things that we saw today, different types of phenomena. So right now I'm more in the question phase than in the answer phase. But I hope that you liked it interesting anyway. So that's that. Okay, good. Thank you. Now your question.
Okay. Do you want me to repeat it? Or?
No. So your question was very puzzling to me. So your question was whether I distinguish magic and religion.
Well, the question was, to what extent, if any, are you concerned with distinguishing between religion and magic? Because, at least as you mentioned, in the older literature, there's a lot of emphasis on distinguishing between religion and magic.
Yeah.
For example, here in the Tartu, when Yuri Lotman talked about religion, magic, and semiotics, his emphasis is on distinction. Mm. And so I'm wondering, are you also concerned making that distinction, or do you think that distinction is not important, or do you think that sometimes it's important?
Yeah, it puzzles me because it undermines the entire thing which I just presented. The question. Because I would never use magic in an essentialist manner which allows me to distinguish it from religion, which I would also not define in an essentialist manner. So this is what I call discursive study of religion, or discursive study of magic. And when doing that, as you rightly note, and as you have seen, the material I presented was often taken from all sorts of religious traditions. It was rather coming from the core of some religious traditions than from the margins, as we would expect when we think about magic.
Sorry, if I may interject, what I'm seeing is a clear lack of boundaries or criteria.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned McClure, for instance. McClure is anti-witchcraft, not witchcraft. And this is an ongoing pattern about distinguishing between practices which were socially accepted and practices which you may consider within the realm of what you mean by magic, but we don't know what you mean because you have said that definitions may be annoying, but there seems you jump from period to period and from area of the world to area of the world. Mm-hmm. And the socio-historical background is not provided, so perhaps some kind of definition according to that period from them somehow, I don't know. But
okay, I can see.
Also, yesterday with your contemporary talk, I felt the same thing. Like if this is going to be a dissatisfaction of so alternatives to conventional religions, however we may define religions, but then I would have expected some kind of general framework. So within Scientology, the Mormons, whatever practices that are ongoing, shamanism, neo-shamanism, whatever, we are in particularly focusing on these magic practices, things based on texts, and distinguishing between people who take this very seriously and do the research, and people who may do it temporarily, and what reasons drive each, I don't know, some kind of boundaries.
Okay, I can see that you have a problem that I don't define anything. I don't feel that problem because by not defining the thing and disentangling and having all these sorts of meanings and notions, I think that this is the progress, so that we have a more nuanced analysis of these different things which I presented. Yes, I don't feel the necessity to define. It would be completely absurd, and maybe even create boundaries.
Where do you stop your research, or how do you categorize? I don't know. What a ritual, but ritual.
No, ritual is just one element of many. Okay.
I just want to say that my interest in asking the question is because I also want to stay away from an essentialist conception of magic. That's something I was convinced when it says magic, that an essentialist approach to magic simply will not work. On the other hand, there certainly are contexts in which religion and magic will sometimes be distinguished, other contexts in which they will overlap. And so it's one of
No, I would never say that. Religion and magic sometimes overlap, sometimes distinct. No, that's an essentialist formulation. Because you have something in your mind where you would say, okay, this is magic and this is religion. And here I have a case where it overlaps. This is completely different from the methodology which I just presented. I don't have anything in mind when I speak about
the concept of dramaturgia, for example, on the magic, when you explain to Apollonius Fiana or Jesus Christ what happened with for another kind, one talk about Heka. Heka is hierophantic developing the god for magic actions, not for personal actions. I want to pass the way of life. No, it's for new states of consciousness, or developing the way of life inner. Another kind is to materialism of the nothing, like Saivada materialism. Yeah. But this kind of the so-called actions or reactions in the magic, there are no classification. It's the same of when ask you about the idea or theologian in classifications in Leipzig manuscripts. There are no any how do you say analyze this boundary, say, and the possibility for study actions of reactions neurophenomenologically now. What happened with the consciousness of the practices of magic actions?
So I didn't hear a question.
Yes, this is the panorama, what the conclusions of the...
Yeah. Okay, I can adapt these remarks in the sense that I realized that you rather want boundaries between the terms. And I think I didn't dissolve the boundaries, I just made them more nuanced. So there are more boundaries than we thought previously. It's not just magic versus religion. In magic, we have different semantic layers, and some of them overlap more or less with what, I don't know, we know from many other religions. And so it's more complicated. It's not just one boundary or two terms that kind of are conflated.
That is exactly what I mean.
Ah, okay.
That is exactly what I mean.
Okay, sorry, I simply didn't.
There's no Trump-like wall between religion and magic.
Yeah.
So what I mean is that, say, when I look at very particular case studies, if I read Albertus Magnus talking about magic, or Pliny the Elder talking about magic, if I read a Shia theologian writing about magic, sometimes these terms they'll place them very far apart, sometimes they'll bring them very close together. And so it's more like a dance between these terms. And I'm trying to find what kind of what's the pattern of this dance.
I mean, so I focused on magic, but I did not really define religion, in any way. For me, as a religious studies scholar, everything which I've shown is religion. On the discursive level, magic has become an important term to denote many things or not as magic, and there were disputes whether something is magic or not. But from a second-order perspective, I usually also would say that Western learned magic, the stuff I presented yesterday and the day before yesterday, it is a religious phenomenon. It is a religious discourse. And today my argument was a bit different because I thought if magic could also be risen or heightened, to be also a second-order category, not only religion. And when doing so, in the way I did it, we will see that it's complicated. So many things that are in the semantic field of magic, which we cannot simply neglect. They resemble many things that we know from many religions. That may be one of the reasons why it has always been so difficult to separate the terms. But now I think through this analysis we can see it clearly and also reasonably argue, okay, things that we have labeled in Western history, magic, some marginal side, weird ritual performed by some people we don't even know about because they were prosecuted, then we find that the same thing is kind of in the center of other texts or religious traditions. And then that's simply an interesting finding, I think, because when we stay on the level of these lower elements, we don't have the problem of demarcating magic and religion. It simply doesn't arise, the question, because we just see elements, important motives, which are present in the history of religion in general, like miracle, power, ritual, wish-fulfilment, all these four. But they are simply located in very, very different discursive contexts. Sometimes they're more on the margins, sometimes they are completely part of mainstream religion. I think that's interesting.
Perhaps we have questions elsewhere as well.
Well, thank you. This was very systematic, very, very clear. Wonderful, brave approach to magic. My question is about these metaphoric uses of the concept of magic, like magic in commercials, or magic performed on stage. Well, like Houdini or David Copperfield.
Yeah.
Would you also consider this as a part of your research, or you would exclude this as it's a discursive approach to magic?
The discursive approach would also include advertisements, modern media, also stage magic. Yes, it's all part of the Western discourse about magic. I mean, and stage magic also has connections to the real magic, which I presented yesterday or the day before yesterday. There are historical connections between the emergence of stage magic and like the real stuff. Yes, from a discursive perspective, this can all be analyzed because it's all different discourses or different layers or different aspects of society, but it's all talk about magic, isn't it? Yeah. But I will, of course, focus now more on religious stuff, religious material, more from a comparative perspective. Thank you.
So anyone else for a quick question?
Just a friendly comment. You brought some examples about Finns and Samis as nations of sorcerers claimed by others. And of course, you were also now visiting a nation of sorcerers. Because from eastwards, Estonians, or at least part of Estonians, were claimed to be Jews. And we have this Lake Peipus, which is on the border with Russia, which is called in Russian Chudskoye ozero, because of miracle makers, Chuds.
Yeah.
So it was also kind of part of...
Nice.
Astlanda väide ka ju.
Okay. To you, healing, can healing also be described in a way as magic?
So, I'm always puzzled by these questions. If you want, do it. I can do it from a discursive perspective. For instance, if I have a ritual script from a magician which includes healing, which is very common. So healing runs through Western learned magic. And then it's also in the discourse of exclusion, healing rites performed by others called magic. Yes, sometimes healing rites are called magic, but very often not. It depends on the context. That's the discursive perspective. There is no essential magical meaning of healing. It depends who labels something or not.
Interesting.
And yeah, sorry.
So, unless there is a very quick question, I think we have to conclude so that Bernd doesn't miss his bus.
Yeah, one quick question? No?
My maybe was not so big. Maybe I can send you
Big.
an email.
A big question, yeah.
So
Because
you
I'd like to
can,
ask
you can-
more in details.
you can find in the link in the news his webpage, and there's an email there, and you can write him and he'll answer the very complicated question. Hopefully.
I mean, it's long.
Yeah, please do.
Thank you all for coming, and
Yes, thank you.
doing your best.